Ukrainian soldiers have liberated the village of Pankka and the surrounding areas from Russian occupiers in the Dobropilya direction. This was reported by fighters from the 1st Corps of Ukraine's National Guard, Azov. The invaders tried to hold their positions by bringing in additional reserves, including 4 infantry brigades and a marine regiment. However, Ukrainian soldiers managed to drive the enemy out of the settlement.
Dobropilya is a raid that our defense forces have halted, split into fragments, and are now trying to destroy them. To prevent this from happening, the Russians are transferring forces, what they consider elite ones, like the 155th Marine Brigade, to try to prevent. Well, there's already been a partial encirclement in the northern part, and basically destruction.
The Russian invaders are attempting to occupy Kupyansk in the Kharkiv region. Enemy troops have not entered the city. However, sabotage groups have managed to infiltrate beyond the city limits. The Russians are trying to amass forces on the northern outskirts, using civilian clothing and fake documents. Ukrainian soldiers also note that the gas pipeline, which Russian troops had used to break into Kupyansk from the north, is now under fire control by the Ukrainian armed forces.
The enemy managed to enter the outskirts from the north in the area of the cemetery, and once again, probably for the 3rd time, used the pipeline along which, through the communications, they had been advancing for 4 days straight, just in case, to reach the necessary spot. This created a threat. They're trying to contain the actions of our units and subunits, as well as the enemy's actions. And that's why the situation around Kupyansk has worsened because of this.
Meanwhile, in the Lyman direction, Ukrainian units repelled Russian attacks toward the settlements of Rakivka, Darylivka, Shandryholov, Kolodyazy, and Torsky. On the Siversk sector, the enemy army tried in vain to advance in the areas of Serebryanka, Ryhorivka, Fort Yampil, and Dranivka. On the Pokrovsk direction, which is the hottest spot, fighting took place, particularly near Vladimirovka, Novoekonomik, Kotlin, Myrnarad, Promin, and Novoivanivka.
We know that about a month ago, well, a few weeks back, they were moving reinforcements, pulling their troops from Sumy region and redeploying them both toward Pokrovsk and to Zaporizhia, where military activity has also intensified. Regarding Pokrovsk and the Myrnarad agglomeration, intense fighting continues. According to the statistics on assaults that you provided, it's clear that, well, there are about 170 in total, and around 40, give or take, around Pokrovsk and Myrnarad.
Ukrainian intelligence operatives struck a Russian Buk M3 surface-to-air missile system in the Zaporizhia direction. This was reported by the press service of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The strike landed near the settlement of Oleksandrivka. The cost of such a Russian air defense system ranges from $40 to $50 million. On one of the eastern fronts, drone pilots from the Ukrainian unit Signum are hunting for the vehicles of Russian occupiers. They shared the results of their combat operations over the past day online. For example, the operators managed to hit an enemy Ural truck. The invaders covered the cab with a frame net, but it didn't help. Ukrainian soldiers also spotted a Kamaz truck loaded with logs for building fortifications. The first Ukrainian drone stopped the truck, and the second one hit the fuel tank directly. As a result, the vehicle was completely burned. Defense Forces attacks destroyed a Russian military base in temporarily occupied Crimea. This was reported by the partisan movement Atesh. Agents observed that there was almost no equipment left on the site, and the few remaining vehicles appeared to be out of order. Atesh also noted a shortage of equipment among the Russians. It is being moved all over the peninsula to protect it from strikes by Ukrainian defense forces. In the past 24 hours, Ukrainian defense forces have eliminated another 910 Russian servicemen. Thus, the total losses of the Russian army have exceeded 1,095,000 people. In addition, over the past day, Ukrainian defense forces destroyed 2 armored combat vehicles, 35 artillery systems, 1 multiple rocket launcher, as well as 85 units of enemy automotive and special equipment.
With us is military expert Serhiy Meritovich-Hrabsky. Serhiy, welcome to freedom.
Good evening. Greetings to the studio.
Well, there is some positive news, literally just before our conversation with you. In Donetsk region, specifically in the Pokrovsk direction, there have been successes in clearing a small settlement of Russian occupiers. It's a small settlement, but it seems to me that with such enormous intensity from the Russian occupiers in this direction, the fact that our forces are not only counterattacking but also liberating territory is already a huge success for the defense forces. How difficult is the situation there right now? Let's start with the Pokrovsk direction. How tough is it at the moment? And at the same time, why is it turning out to be a failure for the Russian occupiers?
It's a failure because, with your permission, I'll start with the last question. It's a failure because, despite the overwhelming majority they have, and according to the standards of operational arc, if you outnumber your enemy by 3 times, not to mention 4 to 6 times as General Syrskyi has stated, you should be guaranteed success. Well, just based on the fact that there's such a science as ergonomics, and for one soldier to fight off 4 to 6 opponents is practically impossible under modern conditions, especially if you add superiority in equipment, aviation, ammunition, and everything else. And here we're simply witnessing a phenomenal situation where the Russian army turned out to be, physically incapable of withstanding the Ukrainian defense. The Russian army is trying to push forward not even with an open hand, but more like with individual fingers in separate directions, and it's not really working out for them. That's exactly why we're seeing a situation that, in principle, breaks all the norms and rules of operational art, where the side with a recognized minority somehow manages to counterattack and successfully disrupt all the patterns, all the algorithms of the attacking side. That's exactly why we're seeing, despite the fact that the number of combat engagements isn't decreasing, it remains steady and at a fairly high level, and at least 30% of all recorded combat engagements are happening in the Pokrovsk direction, yet the enemy isn't achieving any significant results. They're being pushed into the territory, yes. Here I'd like to quote Teeth Telog, who says that this isn't about success, it's about some number of meters. In operational arc, success isn't measured in meters, it's measured in distances and tens of kilometers. We haven't seen that here, and we haven't seen it for a long time now. So, basically, that's why we can talk about the failure of the Russian army's offensive in the way it's supposed to be carried out.
Sergei Meritovic, you've already mentioned the tactics of the Russian Federation. You made it very clear by comparing it to how they're not pressing with the palm, but rather with each finger separately in different directions. And in the context of the Russian Federation supposedly launching some kind of auto-military operation, are we seeing any changes? Maybe there's some information about what might have changed for them, though I'm not even sure what that could be, since their main goal, to terrorize Ukraine, hasn't changed. But maybe in some areas their priorities are shifting, or their strategy or tactics in combat are changing. Has anything at all changed in the context of this auto-military operation?
No, because Russia's strategy and overall military art are strictly structured in a top-down hierarchy. There is a specific objective that needs to be accomplished and have already been declared, namely the Donetsk region. And, I really don't like making such assumptions, but one could suppose that there were some discussions that, Putin would capture the Donetsk region and then stop there. But that's just an assumption. In other words, we don't really have the means to fairly assess this or to assume that it's actually true. Nevertheless, it does look like the enemy is putting in maximum effort specifically to attack in the Donetsk direction. And, strange as it may sound, despite the fact that, as we've already established, Russia has a colossal advantage in forces and resources, it has simply turned out to be basically incapable of conducting simultaneous offensive operations of an operational nature in multiple directions. Therefore, having gotten bogged down in battles in the Donetsk region, a region that, from an offensive standpoint, is very, very, very inconvenient because, let's put it this way, it used to be a highly urbanized area in the past, unfortunately. Unfortunately, we have to understand that the Russians have done everything possible to make sure it never becomes that way again. And yet, such terrain, the very nature of this area, greatly limits the enemy's capabilities, especially when it comes to using equipment. That's why we say that no, nothing has changed. We also don't really see any changes in the priority of directions, although the enemy, taking advantage of their numerical superiority, and we have to be honest about this, is trying to put pressure on other sections of the front. We see a rather difficult situation in the Kupyansk area. We see a rather difficult situation in the London area as well, where the enemy is trying to push our troops toward the Siversky Donets, forcing them to retreat. This is a very serious problem. But again, this is connected to the fact that a significant factor in the enemy's advance is the insufficient density of Ukrainian troops. But in other directions, we don't see any serious system that would indicate a change in tactics or the main approach to the use of Russian troops. The same kinds of assaults are continuing, including the use of equipment. By the way, if you pay attention to the trends you've mentioned, specifically the number of destroyed vehicles, you'll recall that just a few months ago it seemed normal when the General Staff of Ukraine reported the destruction of a tank company, at least 10 tanks a day. But now, it's just 1 to 3 tanks a day. This also indicates that the enemy does not have the ability to use equipment on a large scale, and therefore they are unable to change their approach to conducting operations.
Sergei Meritovich, there's another point here. If we now see that the Russian occupiers and Putin in general have concentrated the maximum number of their troops on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, the Russian Federation has an advantage in manpower, an advantage in missiles. Is it possible to achieve a positive result for Ukraine? I mean, to see more news about the deoccupation of Ukrainian territory from Russian occupiers by having superiority in the number of missiles and drones? Or is it possible here to implement some more modern methods so that quality can overcome quantity?
Well, let's separate all these things. That is, trying to reach parity in manpower, in the number of tanks, artillery, or even missiles is impossible. It's impossible because Russia simply has many times more of these weapons and greater production capabilities. Be that as it may, does this mean that everything is hopeless? Not at all. And by the way, right now we're doing a lot, to balance out this numerical, but not exactly qualitative, advantage. Just look at what's happening on the southern front. So, what's happening on the southern front? Pretty much nothing. The enemy is unable to carry out large-scale offensive operations, and that's because Ukraine has focused on striking deep into the enemy's formations and rear areas where Russian troops are located. I'm talking specifically about the occupied Crimea. So, this tactic by the Ukrainian forces is leading to, and has already led to, a 30% reduction in the combat capabilities of Russian groups in the southern direction. What we're talking about is that, as a result of constant strikes on targets in the temporarily occupied Crimea, the enemy is unable to quickly and promptly replenish its supplies of weapons, military equipment, and ammunition. The enemy is unable to increase the intensity of airstrikes because their radar and control systems have been disrupted. The enemy is experiencing certain difficulties. For now, we're talking about certain difficulties in the logistical support of the troops, because the supply lines are also under attack. So, this is the method that allows Ukraine to counteract, so to speak. And in addition, there's the creation of what is now called a kill zone. That is, creating a higher quality, and here I agree with you, a higher quality principle of building defense as a combination of maneuverable defense and a combination of maneuverable forces and assets, particularly drones. In other words, organizing coordination between different units and subdivisions of the Ukrainian defense forces in order to deliver concentrated strikes in those directions where the enemy intends to concentrate their strike groups. Specifically in this sense, intends to concentrate, because our intelligence has the capability to look deep into the enemy's battle formations and identify the moments when the enemy is massing its forces, allowing us to strike them. But again, as you know, you can't win just by defending. That's why it's necessary here to keep ramping up strikes deeper in, keeping in mind that there's a very wide range of targets in exactly this order. A very wide range of targets is located in the tactical defense zone, meaning we shouldn't ease up the pressure on the enemy in the operational and strategic depth, and we need to strike at targets that are within reach, including those accessible to our tactical strike assets. In other words, this kind of fire impact on the enemy allows us to intensify the concentration of fire or strike assets on specific areas.
Sergei Meritovic, you've already mentioned the use of drones by the Ukrainian army to carry out strikes, but they're also being used quite successfully for defense now, right? I'd like to talk about that in a bit more detail. Ukraine now has interceptor drones that are capable of countering Russian Shahed drones with jet engines. This was stated by Pavlo Pali, the deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine. According to him, each model demonstrates different levels of effectiveness, which is influenced by many factors, ranging from the model itself to the cruise training and even weather conditions. Also, according to the official, Ukraine is trying to build an optimal system at different altitudes and lines in order to effectively counter any massive aerial threats. In the context of this information, we also know that the Russian Federation, if you can call it that, seems to take a special kind of pleasure in terrorizing peaceful Ukrainian cities in order to destabilize the morale of Ukrainians. Experts have repeatedly mentioned this on our broadcast. With the development of these air defense technologies, and with the increasing quantity and quality of these interceptor drones and Russian Shaheds, which are probably the most widely used type of weapon launched at peaceful cities right now, right? Because they are much cheaper than missiles. So, how does this particular aspect, meaning the successful defense we are seeing, how does that impact the Russian Federation? And what is the potential effect on the mood and morale within the Russian troops, especially when they witness for themselves that Ukraine is demonstrably getting stronger and more capable? Not only is Ukraine fighting back at the front, but it's also protecting its peaceful cities more effectively.
You know, to put it briefly, sometimes, just to boost your optimism, I can recommend casually browsing through Russian social media groups, where you'll see what we call a Jeremiah's Lament. Russians are crying out that they simply don't have enough personnel on the front lines. People, well, you know, even though they are seriously poisoned by propaganda, they are still simply, quite frankly, afraid to die. And that's one aspect. Another aspect, as I already mentioned, is the increased depth of strikes by our offensive weapons on enemy positions. That is, it's important to understand that command posts and enemy air defense systems should also be targeted. By the way, these are also used as instruments of terror, launching upgraded S-300 and S-400 missiles, albeit in smaller numbers compared to before. And striking the enemy supply lines, if we're talking about the tactical zone, means the enemy should feel the impact here and now. Deeper strikes require careful planning and resource concentration because, let's be honest, the effectiveness of long-range drones is about 20, at most 25%. So, out of 10 drones sent toward the enemy, only about 2 or 3 actually hit their target. This means we need to improve both the quality of the drones, making them less vulnerable to enemy electronic warfare and air defense, and also increase their numbers. In other words, the goal is for that 25% to mean 4 to 6 drones hitting the target, not just 2 or 3. That would already be a big success. So, there's a lot of work to do, a huge amount, really. And basically, Ukraine is now doing something Russia can't defend against, expanding the range of produced systems, specifically strike systems. Because, as you can imagine, air defense, put simply, is a lot like a computer antivirus program. It can only fight the types of threats it knows about and is designed to handle. If it doesn't recognize a threat, then it simply can't fight it. These are the indicators that determine our next steps. Ukraine can ramp up production here, and it's important to understand the following. Russia, due to the specifics of its territory, is physically unable to organize the defense of all the critical elements of its infrastructure, all the key parts of its military-industrial complex, and all the enterprises that support its war effort. They can't do it. Moreover, if Ukraine makes effective enough use of the concept of mobile groups, and I'm not saying they're perfect, then Russia can't even create a reasonable algorithm where these mobile groups are integrated with anti-aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery systems like we see with the Jeopards. So basically, they just don't have anything like that. That's why we carefully study the structure of Russian forces, closely examine the targets that fall within our special area of interest, and develop unconventional technologies and methods to strike these targets.
Sergei Maratovic, thank you so much. We are always glad to have you on Freedom for your constructive stance, and thank you for finding the time to join us. Sergei Hrabsky, military expert, was with us live.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.